But as we were discussing, what this tends to do is sort of nibble around the edges. You find particularly egregious, silly, stupid uses of government money, but you're not really getting to the heart of the matter, which is that the stuff that's not waste, fraud, and abuse, the intended purposes of spending the money, whether it's domestic spending or military spending, whatever it might be, that's where the real corruption is in the system, because the system itself is corrupt, that it exists now to spend money for corrupt purposes, for things that have nothing really to do with either the welfare of the American people, however you want to define that, but even much less any system of constitutional or limited government as the founders intended. So I think that's where the real problem is, and we can hope that the so-called Doge works out better in that regard. But I'm extremely skeptical to say the least.
Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you. Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 251. I'm talking to Jim Jatras. He's a smart guy. I've heard him on Buck Johnson's show a few times, so I figured I'd bring him on. He also had a tweet about the ill-fated Grace Commission, which was a group of people who were looking to cut government waste, and it was something possibly similar to what's now being called the Department of Government Efficiency. And we're going to talk to Jim about that and why it worked, why it didn't work. How are you, Jim?
I've been better. I've been worse, and I'm still cautiously pessimistic.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little cautiously optimistic about Trump's election. To me, the best thing he said was when he declared Javier Milei my favorite president. I was happy to hear that. So, and certainly Jay Bhattacharya is a good move, but in the National Institute of Health. But outside of that, I'm still kind of unsure. Jim, what's your background with all this? Things like government waste. I mean, you're older than I am, so you've been around and seen this happen. You certainly remember the Reagan years.
Yeah, considerably older. I wouldn't say I have much background in government waste per se. I mean, I started out my professional career, if you want to call it that, after I went to law school as a foreign service officer at the State Department. First in Mexico, and then at the Office of Soviet Union Affairs, and then in the Office of the Undersecretary of Political Affairs, and then for more than 17 years working in the Republican leadership in the U.S. Senate, mostly on foreign policy issues, but some domestic issues too. So obviously, I had a lot of exposure to programs that had to do with government spending, but that was not the primary focus of my work. It was mostly on what you might call broader policy issues.
Yeah, and now you live in in Virginia, a little bit between Fredericksburg and Richmond. So you're still not that far from DC, but maybe you.
Hopefully I'm out of the blast zone when this all goes wrong, but who knows?
Out of the blast zone, it's still close enough to smell it. But yeah, maybe so. Yeah. So yeah, Jim. So what can you tell us about the Grace Commission? This was I believe, commissioned in 1982 with a gentleman named J. Peter Grace, and they were going to look at government waste.
Well, I think the idea was that government should be run efficiently, like a business. And if we can get a businessman in there to look at the way the government spends money and to do it efficiently and eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse, that we can make the government more streamlined, more bang for the buck for the taxpayers, and so on and so forth. And what it did was essentially look at, again, to the best of my memory, is the particularly egregious examples where the government was spending money foolishly. Everybody likes to talk about, what is it, the 14,000 toilet seats on airplanes or hammers and things like that cost 100 times more than you can buy them for on, at the hardware store. And all those things exist, of course. And that's mostly what the Grace Commission did, as I recall. It's very similar, as we were talking about before we came on, we were looking at Citizens Against Government Waste. They have their yearly pig report. where they would, give egregious examples of what they thought was pork spending, where members were simply spending money to benefit their constituencies that had no particular bearing on what would constitute somebody's idea of good government. But as we were discussing, what this tends to do is sort of nibble around the edges. You find particularly egregious, silly, stupid uses of government money, but you're not really getting to the heart of the matter, which is that the stuff that's not waste, fraud, and abuse, the intended purposes of spending the money, whether it's domestic spending or military spending, whatever it might be, that's where the real corruption is in the system, because the system itself is corrupt, that it exists now to spend money for corrupt purposes, for things that have nothing really to do with either the welfare of the American people, however you want to define that, but even much less any system of constitutional or limited government as the founders intended. So I think that's where the real problem is, and we can hope that the so-called Doge works out better in that regard. But I'm extremely skeptical to say the least.
Yeah, I am too, just because we've heard this song before, where Reagan gets inaugurated and says government is the problem. You heard it to a certain extent in 1994 with the contract with America, because this was,
sure.
Because people may not realize that was the red team taking over both houses of Congress after over 40 years of being the minority party. And we really had a back and forth somewhat between the red and blue team since then, but there's often been, this, and even Bill Clinton, once said the era of big government is over. We've had this happen before, and it's just not. And I don't see anybody who's I don't think Trump is really ideologically committed to anything like this. It's
no. And by the way, I couldn't help but wondering when you said the red team taking over with when the Republicans took the House. Technically, the Republicans were not yet the red team. Red did not get fixed on the Republicans until the 2000 election. Up till then, blue had been more or less the Republican color. And Reagan was blue all over the map. Anyway, that's neither here nor there.
Yeah, that did kind of switch. I don't know why. I mean, I remember looking at the 1980 election, and they were actually reversed. So it's
yeah. I wrote a piece on this some years ago. I'll send it to you if it's of interest. Anyway. The long and the short of it is that, yes, they always promise. Look, even FDR came into office promising to get government spending under control, and look what happened with him. At least to his credit, I don't think LBJ actually promised that, although maybe he did, but he had a little war going on his hands. The fact is at most what they do is argue a little bit about the spending priorities. Guns versus better. Which part of the warfare state do you favor more? Which, how many conservatives who bitch and moan about government spending don't seem to realize that war is a big federal program, and they're more than happy to shower money on the Defense Department and its various, trough feeders. All those McMansions around the Beltway have to get paid for somehow, don't they? And so it essentially, the whole thing is a kind of a big welfare program for your favored constituents. But it really is, there's only a little bit of haggling over whose scoundrels are going to get paid off more, mine or yours. That's the whole limit of the red versus blue debate.
Yeah, and the one thing we've learned too, though, is the more a senator or a representative stays in D.C., the more friendly he becomes toward all this spending, no matter what the party is. I mean, term limits might be one thing that could partially fix this, but other than that, I don't know.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because I hear that a lot from people. And my first posting at the State Department was in Mexico, in Tijuana, right across from San Diego. And in the Mexican Revolution of 1910, I guess it started, the slogan was "Sufragio efectivo, no reelección." Effective suffrage, no re-election, because Porfirio Diaz, the president, had been elected year after year after year before the revolution. They're saying you have to have effective suffrage, so that you cannot. So all government offices in Mexico are term limited. You can only serve one term. That's it. And what that does is what they have is not democracia, not democracy, but dedocracia. I pick with my finger my successor. So I've had my term slopping at the trough. Now it's your turn. Oh, now it's your turn. And now it's your turn. So term limits doesn't fix it either. I mean, you're right that there's a tendency for these perpetually reelected people to just keep on doing what they do, term in, term out, year in and year out. But term limits isn't necessarily going to fix it. It's simply going to institutionalize the next scoundrel taking the shoes of his patron scoundrel whom he replaces.
That's true. And sometimes, you have husband-wife, combinations,
Yeah.
and it certainly happens. So, yeah. And, I think we're also in a point, Jim, where a lot of laws are effectively made by bureaucrats. I mean, Congress just kind of says, okay, this agency can do this, and they have the power to do this. So the agencies become these the agencies end up becoming the lawmakers, which isn't how it's supposed to be. But, and that's really, I think, another issue. And in many cases, these civil servants are just kept there permanently,
And if even they weren't, as I say, I think you'd get the same kind of succession phenomenon as you do at the legislative level if you had term limits. But you're right; they have ceded. It's interesting. The war power belongs to Congress, according to the Constitution. That's a dead letter, of course. But the fact is, Congress doesn't want that power. It's much easier to let the executive do whatever it is they want, and then they can complain when things go wrong. And maybe on some, for example, that is one thing we saw during the 1990s under Clinton. Congress did finally lay down the law regarding the deployment in Somalia. A fairly small matter by American global empire standards, and did really require a pullout from Somalia. But that's a very rare thing. Congress really doesn't want this power. And frankly, Congress doesn't want to rein in the bureaucracy. Would they really want to limit the size of government and themselves have to administer what bureaucratic state exists by actually approving in Congress every little law that is now in the form of regulations that have the force of law? They don't want that. They don't, frankly, if we had anything like the size of the government we had, there's simply no way they could do that. Now, you and I could argue, great, let's reduce the size of government and not all have all these laws and regulations. But there's no constituency for that because this is such a money-making machine for so many people that are receiving end of all this government spending and the laws and regulation. Nobody wants to fix that. It's the nature of the beast itself now. And honestly, I don't know how it can be fixed other than after some kind of a fundamental collapse where, kind of comparable to what happened in the Soviet Union, where it all comes crashing down and you have to start from scratch.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring up the 90s too, because, it was when Clinton was in the White House and during those last, during his second term, when the red team controlled both houses of Congress, that we actually did have budget surpluses for a while. I mean, that was the last time we knew any budget surpluses when the overall deficit was still, about $4 trillion. So, maybe we would have been better off, having red Congresses and having Harris, because at least they would have fought each other a little bit. With Harris in the White House. I mean, Harris has some absolutely horrible ideas, but she would get pushback on almost all of them, I would hope, from Congress. But whereas now, when you have the red team controlling everything, well, what happened in Bush's first term? It was absolutely a disaster, or the second Bush's first term.
Yeah. Well, there is that theory that divided government is the best thing, that they have checks and balances on each other. I suspect that what you end up with, though, in such cases, is that one thing they can agree on most of the time is spending money. In other words, they'll disagree a little on priorities, but the way they handle that is, okay, I'll agree to your pork and you agree to my pork. And, well, they'll find a way to get along. Scylla and Charybdis can come to an agreement on things.
Yeah, the other thing too is we've talked a little bit about firing employees. I get it's not that easy to fire somebody who works for the federal government. Is that correct? I mean, you've mentioned for example, that if they try to cut departments, you have all these unions now. There could be lawsuits, all kinds of stuff tied up in court. What's going to happen? If they try to cut, what happens? For example, if they say, okay, the Department of Education is gone. Everybody's fired.
Um, well, you'd have to get legislation to do that, of course, because
Yep.
the existence of the department is authorized. I think that would be a very difficult thing. I think what you probably see almost certainly is if that were to happen. I'm giving you a best case scenario. That there would be some kind of decentralization, that you would break up the embassy, the department, and then take its components, which would still be federal offices of some sort, and either possibly abolish some of those or consolidate some of those into something else. Because remember, before, for example, HHS was set up, we had a separate department of what was it, health, and then somehow they moved some other agencies into that. Same thing happened with DHS. You might decentralize it, and in the best of circumstances, maybe they would return some of those functions to the states and said, okay, these offices now belong to the state of Texas, state of Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, whatever. If you want to run it and fund it, that's your business. But that's the best outcome I can probably think of in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I've even heard some people complain, Trump is going to make all these employees at will. I don't know how easy it's going to be to do that. Jim, I remember back in 2000, Harry Brown simply proposed, I'll stop hiring new employees. Would it be possible just to, maybe not lay off anybody or fire anybody, but just say we're having a hiring freeze and nobody gets hired for 8 years? Or 4. Well, Trump's only got 4 years, but nobody gets hired for 4 years. Would that work, and what kind of impact might that have?
That could have some kind of a temporary, partial impact. There have been hiring freezes in the past. But they tend to be fairly short term, and it's not so much the personnel themselves, but the functions that they're tasked with. Like, for example, you'll hear sometimes people say, abolish the IRS. Okay, are you going to abolish our whole tax system while you're at it? How are you going to get that through Congress? And if we have the current tax system, even if you abolish the IRS, somebody somewhere has to be in charge of administering the tax system that we have, right? I mean, unless you abolish the policies themselves and the programs themselves, it's not the individuals who are carrying them out who are necessarily the problem. They're just, doing what they're told. They pour water into one vessel and pour back into the other one and, shuffle the paper the way they're supposed to. And, I think it's kind of easy to say, oh, it's those bureaucrats who are ruining everything. Well, the bureaucrats are just doing what they're hired to do because the programs themselves exist. The policies themselves exist. This is all authorized by law. And how's that going to get fixed? In other words, if we have the current welfare warfare state we have that demands so much money, I always wonder myself, by the way, if the Federal Reserve can just invent money out of thin air, why do we pay taxes in the first place? Why doesn't the government just create as much money as they need to spend and spend it without asking for ours?
Yeah, that seems to be the case. Maybe they just don't want, they just don't want it to be too profound. I mean, Americans really haven't experienced some of the horrible inflation that other people experience elsewhere. It's really, but that's because we just export all our inflation in all these countries, eat up our dollars, and
and indeed, that is itself a function of the warfare state, and that's something that I think a lot of people who are opposed to American global empire don't want to face, which is that if we did not have this posture of a force projection all around the world, we would not be able to impose the kind of dollar seigniorage we have on the rest of the world. We can buy all this cheap stuff at Walmart and Kmart and everything else for a lot less than it's worth, because our dollar is worth a lot more than it really should based on our productive capacity.
And that's another thing too. I often wonder, if we had not abandoned the gold standard in 1971, which was also supposed to be temporary, would we have lost all of this manufacturing? Because there's lots of theories, on when we started losing all this manufacturing. But we're for a long time we've now been a country that consumes more than we produce, and yet somehow we still get away with that. And I don't see how that can go on forever.
No, it probably can't go on forever. But getting back to what we were talking about earlier with term limits and things like that, as long as you're in office, to say, as long as it continues while I'm still in office, and I can
Yeah.
still run the scam as long as my face is up there in front of the TV cameras, that's good enough. If it all collapses after I'm gone, after me, the flood, right? So it's as long as they can keep the perpetual motion machine going for the short term, that's good enough. And if the short term can you kick the can down the road, well, so far it's worked, right?
Yeah. How do you think the Chevron decision might impact this? Because this was saying, that, the Chevron decision that we had last summer, where they basically said, the agencies can't really make laws. They have to, or the courts will not the courts will not allow these agencies to make the laws. The courts have to, interpret things themselves.
I'd have to look at the details of the decision to see what exactly it said. Generally speaking, regulations have the force of law, that of the underlying legislation that authorized the regulatory agency in the first place. If the courts are saying that they have a right to interpret those regulations with the force of law, like as they do other federal legislation, I don't know that it would change all that much, because again, just as Congress can't possibly keep up with all the hundreds and hundreds of regulations that come out on the Federal Register all the time, can the courts really adjudicate each one of those regulations unless somebody somewhere wants to bring a case, and the case can work itself up through the federal system. And even there, by the way, you'll notice that federal courts tend to be much more deferential to the federal government than they do to state governments. So they would be very, very selective in the number of regulations they could actually review, and even more selective in terms of the ones that they would nullify.
Yeah, that's true. Is there anybody else, in the Trump administration that you think could be actually good for this? I mean, at possibly cutting back some of this stuff we have, I mentioned Jay Bhattacharya only because Jay was a big critic of, the coronavirus policies, but is there anybody else that you have confidence in?
Well, I mean, look, I obviously, I think the biggest thumb in the eye of the order as it exists would be Tulsi Gabbard. If she can be confirmed as the director of national intelligence, I think that would really throw a scare into them. Because in a way, at least from my perspective, and again, my focus is a little different, perhaps because I'm more in the military and foreign policy and national security area. But to a great extent, the intelligence agencies, and particularly the CIA, are the heart of the beast. And if that can be brought under control, which I think would take a miracle, that would be something. In terms of actually trying to trim government spending, obviously the biggest department is HHS. And if RFK is confirmed in that, his priorities are, make America healthy again, trying to rein in some of the abuses that exist in corporate America. I don't know that shrinking the size of the department would be on his top list of priorities. And that, by the way, that's something else, Chris, I think we need to address. There are a lot of, private sector enthusiasts, let's say libertarians, who have this mindset says government bad, private good. And they don't seem to want to face the fact that, it's like we see, for example, in censorship by the tech companies. Well, as long as they're private companies, I guess that's not a First Amendment violation, despite the fact that they're in total collusion with the government. And unfortunately, we've got something so much like what I would call a corporate state capture, that there's no longer much of a distinction between private corporations and public democratic governance. They're basically the same entity now.
Well, if the government, goes out and hires a private police force, I don't think any libertarian is going to say that private police force is still private. But yes, that is a good point. I think true.
Well, that's what we do. That's what we do with prisons, for example, right?
Yeah. It's definitely not. Yeah, but as you pointed out, really, this isn't capitalism. It's just corporate welfare, which is something libertarians. And I do think, also, if we maybe not fire people, but just got rid of some of these regulations. I think, we have a lot of regulations that just make things ridiculously more expensive. The Scandinavian style of socialism seems to be, we'll tax the crap out of you, but we'll still kind of let you do whatever you want. Whereas the American style of, it's not nearly as high tax, but it's also, we'll make you, put in all this red tape because, even in the private sector, you have so many of these people who, and healthcare is as bad as anything where you have just all of these employees whose only job is to push papers and go to meetings, and they don't actually do anything that's really necessary.
Well, it's, I remember the first senator I worked for on Capitol Hill was Bill Armstrong from Colorado. Yeah. And he had this idea that this is, you have to adjust this for $1985. But he had this idea that Congress people should all be paid $300,000 a year, and they should be docked $1,000 for every day that they're in session. And that would certainly incentivize them to do whatever work they had to do and get the hell out of town. And I suppose you could do the same thing with bureaucrats, is that some people had the idea that it would be more worthwhile if we actually paid the bureaucrats their salaries to stay home and not go in and write all these stupid regulations, that they're actually doing harm by going to their jobs. So I'm not sure that bureaucrats wasting time is necessarily a bad thing for taxpayers.
Yeah, but you also have a lot of, having worked in healthcare, which is still, at least in theory, private, a lot of these corporations, they operate really just like the government in a lot of ways. You have I don't know if you're familiar with the James Burnham theories of the managerial revolution. We have this country where we're really controlled by this managerial class, or other people call it.
And the revolving door, the turnover. Yeah. I mean, look at the guys that Trump is appointing to run the Treasury Department, the Fed, the Commerce Department. And basically, the corporate guys who are part of the industry. And this is typical. I mean, you find people who are, and you can go across the board, whether it's healthcare or anything else, that you're talking about people who are from the very industries they're supposed to be policing. So where's the line exactly between, we'd like to think that, there's this big burden of government that's really stomping all over that productive private sector, and they would be unleashed to do productive things so the government got out of the way. Well, maybe that's the way these corporations want it, because it enriches them. It keeps competitors out of the system. It's a sort of a big, cozy operating environment for them.
And that's the thing too. I like a lot. I like some of the things that Elon Musk has done. I think he's, fought a lot of good fights, but he's still largely, himself a corporate welfare queen or king, and just, taking all these government programs. I mean, he's certainly a very creative, and he's definitely anti-woke, because I think he, knows what happened in South Africa. But other than that, it's just, when you see these people who are always just, who are always out there just, sort of at least profiting to a certain extent because of the government, I wonder naturally how much they're going to cut, or they're, some cases, they want to cut the subsidies to everybody else, but they'll keep the subsidies for themselves. It's.
Somehow I think that Mr. Musk's businesses will not suffer much under the Trump administration. In fact, I saw a report somewhere that I guess his personal holdings have gone up very considerably since the election, because you got to figure a lot of people are going to gravitate to him and figuring, hey, he's going to be the beneficiary of some sweetheart deals here. I mean, you've got the whole thing with, and again, I'm not saying this is the case, but some people have said this, what's the relationship between J.D. Vance and Peter Thiel and Palantir. Palantir, of course, running all the surveillance programs for the feds. I mean, the scriptures say, "Trust not in princes." I guess you say, "Trust not in oligarchs." You pay your money, take your chances. Which oligarch do you think is worse than the next oligarch in terms of your personal preferences? Elon Musk. Hey, he's my favorite African American, but he doesn't have to be everybody's, I guess.
Yeah, I had another guy named Aaron Dayon who talked about how a lot of venture capital investing and stuff is actually, the money actually comes from a lot of these teachers' union retirement systems. And as you can imagine, teachers' unions are very, very much on the woke side. So naturally, you have to wonder where this money is going to go, and whether or not, because I've been scratching my head as a libertarian, just asking myself, what happened to Silicon Valley? if you go back to the late 90s or early aughts, Silicon Valley was at least very libertarian, and now it's just completely they've really become the bad guys. It's pretty wild. And I just wonder how did this happen? It's
Of course, you mentioned the teachers union. They're among the most powerful unions in the country. Again, they've got a very cozy relationship with the Department of Education. The new secretary there, I forget what that person's name is. I don't know if that can be changed at all. But even in a place like here, like in Spotsylvania County, where we recently had a Democratic takeover of the school board, that basically means that the NEA is running our education policy now. And as you say, they're very, very woke, and that just comes with the territory.
And not to mention, Jim, they're also very, very much a part of state legislatures too.
Sure.
Yeah, it's funny. My brother was a mailman for a long time, and I jokingly suggested to him, "Why don't you run for Congress?" He said, "I'd have to quit my job." But you'll see teachers in state legislatures all the time. It's a
good point.
Very much a conflict.
Yeah, and of course, it's look, and I don't begrudge anybody. I'm not necessarily a pro-union guy, but I can understand it. In any working environment, you want good wages, living, working conditions, all that kind of nonsense. But the NEA is not just a teachers union. I mean, it's not just a union. It is, as they say, the National Education Association. They want to be the commissar for the content of education. At least there's a safety valve to the public schools. There are private schools, there's homeschooling and things like that. Yeah. But, as far as I'm concerned, the public schools, I just don't see how they can be vindicated when you have this overlay of a policy organization, and not just some people representing the teachers, workers' rights.
Yeah, Jim, it's interesting to you have your background in foreign policy. I would like to get your take on, some of the recent developments. The first time I've asked anybody, I think we've covered the whole Doge thing enough. But what do you think about what's happened in Syria recently?
I think it's an unmitigated disaster. I mean, we can talk about how it came about and so forth, but let's remember, Chris, the United States has been supporting these radical Salafi Sunni jihadists at least since the Afghan War against the Soviet Union in the 1980s. We used them in Bosnia, we used them in Kosovo, we used them in Libya. And now that we help put them in charge, together with our Turkish and Israelis and British and Ukrainian and other friends, put them in charge in Syria. Our policy had been designed to eradicate Christians from the Middle East. We could not have done a better job. Maybe that actually was the purpose of our policy. I don't know, but it really does relate to the kind of things we've been talking about, because I don't draw a distinction between the kind of growth and overbearing domestic government we have and what we do abroad, because the two are symbiotic. I mean, they're simply two sides of the same coin. We would not have this really goes back even to the immediate post-war period. We couldn't just build national highways. They had to be defense highways, right? I mean, everything we do in the area of big government is related somehow to the aspirations of Washington to be the global hegemon, to dominate all other powers, including to crush the Russians or the Chinese or the Iranians or the North Koreans or the Venezuelans, whoever else we decide is not sufficiently obedient. And that is the purpose of the federal government, both at home and abroad. Unfortunately, there's so many Americans, maybe libertarians as well, but mostly conservative ones, who can be very critical of the American government and how it behaves at home, but they think it's still mom and apple pie when we venture abroad, that we're out there standing for democracy, human rights, and free markets and all that nonsense. And it is nonsense. It's all one big, ugly machine. And I don't see how it gets fixed. I honestly don't, Chris, until it comes crashing down under its own weight. And that's where I really do think there's a parallel to the Soviet Union. Just as the Soviet Union's domestic stability was totally inseparable from the world communist movement. Yeah, the growth of what we see here at home is inseparable from the aspirations of the Washington nomenclatura to be the global hegemon, and that means constant warfare, constant spending, and constant really building a threat to not only the safety of the American people, to our very survival.
It's funny when you talk about, defense, so-called national defense. I remember there's also, the National Defense Education Act, because
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
people got upset, after Sputnik was launched,
Yeah.
and really competition, with the Soviet Union was what motivated, America to put a man on the moon, which, regardless of whether it was a government
Yeah.
policy, is still
Yeah.
really a pretty amazing.
No,
pretty
Chris.
amazing thing to do,
That was all fake. That was all fake. We didn't really land on the moon. No.
But
you can think what you want about that. Yeah, you're right. You're right about that. And there was an interesting paradox there.
Yeah.
That was the reason we needed all of this stuff. And you'd think that then once the Soviet Union and world communism went out of business, we'd say, well, it's Miller time. We can dismantle all that. Remember the peace dividend back in the 1990s? Yes. Whatever happened to the peace dividend? Instead of dismantling all that stuff, instead the very same structure said, aha, now we can really shift into high gear. Now that our competitor has been eliminated, we no longer have a bipolar world. We have a unipolar world. We'll run the whole shebang. How many times have we heard, Stalin wants to rule the world. Hitler wants to rule the world. And whoever a bad guy is wants to rule the world. Well, we want to rule the world. And we're, so far, we're still in the running to do so.
That's true. That's exactly right. I was 18 years old when the Berlin Wall came down. It was all, kind of a thing. Hey, we're going to have relief here. And really that was, thrown out the door when they decided, we're going to expand NATO. And then of course with the, Operation Desert Storm, it was just done right there. I think there were some conservatives who thought we might go back to, pre-Cold War. And it's like, no, not happening. That was the entire attitude.
Yeah.
We can, especially in that whole, document, by the Project for the New American Century, having, let's see what we can do. And, all these people looking for jobs, and in some ways, I wonder if this kind of drives everything. Do you think it drives everything too? Some people say the foreign policy and the CIA, drives everything. It's,
I guess I would say that they are a primary driver, but I think, again, at the risk of overstating this parallel, it is very much like the Soviet nomenclatura. It's one big apparatus of power. It's both foreign and domestic. It's the CIA, but it's also the Department of Education, and it's the Federal Reserve and all the rest of it. And frankly, it's all of the corporations that are part of that. Big pharma, big data, big, all the defense contractors. In other words, as I say, I don't think the private-public distinction is worth much once we get to the top of the structure. It's all one big structure. And I would say it's not even limited to the United States. What's the difference between, say, CIA and MI6? They're essentially the same organization, the whole Five Eyes through the Anglosphere. So, it really is a global apparatus of power.
Yeah, it kind of is. I think they all could be working together. Mossad, some of these other groups. As you pointed out too. You talked about eradicating Christians in the Middle East. I read a tweet a few days ago said it seems like not just almost everything they've done is to try to eradicate, especially Orthodox Christians.
Yeah,
they Russia is evil. And other places too. I don't know how what's going on with Armenia and Azerbaijan would fit into this, for example. But I think Armenians are kind of their own little sect on their own. But certainly the war on Serbia, which also was Orthodox, and do you think there's some truth to that? And what's their beef with Orthodoxy? Is it just because?
Well, I think I would look at it this way. I think there are several layers to it. Obviously, there are very long roots to this whole East-West thing between Orthodoxy and the Western world. Back when the Western world was a Roman Catholic monolith, which of course it is not anymore. But I think there's a tendency for the kind of a progressive ideology that we sometimes describe as wokeness in its current incarnation. Originally, I think at its root is kind of a Gnostic phenomenon, to be hostile to I would say Christianity in specific, and of course being Orthodox, I think that is the core of Christianity, but also to say that any kind of organic, integral social order needs to be broken down, and creating a kind of a rainbow version of the new Soviet man. And whereas the idea that there is an organic aspect of
Yeah.
human life that's based on identity of family, faith, property, all the things that make us who we are, And instead, if we're going to put everybody into the 15-minute cities where we live in pods and own nothing and maybe are deriving universal basic income and so on and so forth, that we have to say, it's what the C.S. Lewis called the abolition of man. We have to strip from you everything that makes you a human being. Your name, your faith, your country, your family, your social relations, your and so on. And so I think in that respect, that Orthodoxy being a very traditional religion, at least in that part of the world, although it's now much more present in the West than it used to be, needs to be eliminated. So, I think, to a lesser extent, that also applies to, conservative Roman Catholics, conservative Protestants, and even some non-Christian religions as well, to the extent that they're organic or integral to the life of various countries that are being targeted for, destruction and then reassembly in this homogenized form. At least that's my view.
Because Gonzalo Lira, the late Gonzalo Lira called it rainbow imperialism. This whole thing, we'll invest in your country, and I know some of the people in Central Europe, the former Warsaw Pact countries are really, they want the money from the EU to invest in stuff, but then they don't want this crap because I think I like to think that because they had communism imposed upon them by a foreign power, they're probably more inoculated against it than the rest of Europe. I mean, I think Western Europe is just a completely lost cause. They're just leave it for dead, But which is really sad. But
Rainbow Imperial. I wrote a piece back in, I think it was in Chronicles magazine. It was 1998 or 99, called "Rainbow Fascism at Home and Abroad," about how this was the direction that the American government was taken. And you're right. I think the communist countries, to a great extent, partly because, at least in Eastern Europe, it was imposed by the Soviet Union, but even within the Soviet Union itself, that there is a kind of an inoculation. I've heard from so many people who come from those countries and now live in the West and look at the way we're developing here and say, you know what, I'm getting a very eerie and uncomfortable feeling of familiarity about what's going on around me. This reminds me very much in some ways of what we used to see back when I was growing up under communism, except it's rainbow instead of red. And in some ways, it's even more destructive and more insidious, because if you talk to people who grew up under communism, they knew where the bright lines were. They knew what the lies were they had to say every day to get on with life. But we all knew they were lies, and everybody understood it perfectly, and life went on. Whereas here, people seem much more befuddled and disoriented by the kind of propaganda we're fed every day. I think there's the degree of social and even personal psychological sickness we see in so many people. The kind of people you see screaming on Twitter, that just seem to be very disturbed mentally and spiritually and morally sick people. And I think that we see a lot more of that here than we used to see back in the old days under communism in those countries.
Yeah, I wonder about that too, the declining birth rates around the world, which is, I showed a map, and the one European country, and that had more than 2.0 or more than 2.0 kids per woman.
Yeah.
What
was Albania?
It was, as I prefer to call it, Sakartvelo, but we call it Georgia.
Oh, Georgia. Okay. Okay, good. I'm glad to see that.
Yeah. I call it that because I got tired of correcting people and saying, no, I'm not talking about Atlanta. I'm talking Sakartvelo is what they call it in their native language. It's a really cool word too. So, but
well, look, I mean, nobody, certainly not a libertarian, would have much good to say about North Korea. But what does it say that South Korea has even a lower birth rate, and I guess the lowest birth rate in the entire world? So for whatever it's worth, South Korea is going to go out of business before North Korea does at this rate.
Yeah, that's very possible. It's really weird to see that happen. Because see these values, because one thing that's interesting about Russia that might inoculate you against it is if you have a horrible war in which you lose a lot of men, and World War II was absolutely horrible for Russia, even though they technically one. But when you have this case where there's so many fewer men, it's almost as if the women, they get to a point where they just have to treat the men really well. I've heard the same thing, also after the War of the Triple Alliance, that Paraguay lost like half of its men. And apparently they still treat men like kings down there because of that.
Well, I think that's true, and also the reciprocal part of that is there's a genuine respect in some of these countries for women as women, not as faux men, in a kind of a feminist sense. I can remember the first time I went and visited the law office of my firm in Kiev. I got there just in time for International Women's Day, which was originally this kind of Rosa Luxemburg kind of feminist, rah, 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 women can do anything kind of holiday. But it really turned into kind of a Valentine's Day, so that basically you go around giving bouquets of flowers to all the women in your life. And, at the office, they'll all give speeches about how wonderful the female coworkers are. And, you're so pretty and so nice, and you make a wonderful girlfriend. And I'm thinking, God, in America, they'd all be calling their lawyers now, But at the same time, they also have Defender of the Fatherland Day, which is the day where all the women pay tribute to all the men in their lives, including their coworkers and their husbands and brothers and fathers and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's something that would be unthinkable. I mean, we don't, Father's Day, we sort of go through the motions, but we don't actually honor men as such in Western societies, much less honoring women as such, except in a kind of a bizarre feminist way.
Yeah, and there's different ways, it's you go into the neighborhood and you talk to that, the grandmother who has, maybe 20 grandchildren. Older women like that have an amazing wisdom that men of the same age just don't have. It's like they know how to read people. They can tell when you can't really lie to them. For example, they can tell if you're lying or not, and that's things like that.
Yeah. Well, it's nobody ever died saying I wish I'd spent more time at the office. It's those things that make us who we are, really, those social relations. And I would say to a great extent, that's even truer of women, because, they are the ones that are the keepers of the hearth and have the ones that those, I can go into details, but you know what I mean?
Yeah. And, nobody will ever make better cornbread, better cinnamon rolls, or better no-bake cookies than grandma. And everybody will say that about their grandma.
Jacques Pepin, the chef, he does have like a cooking show on TV and online, and he says national culture is the food your grandmother made for you.
Yeah. There's a lot of truth there. You have this amazing. There was a balance, and it just seems to be upsetting the apple cart. It's so weird. For example, I don't know if you heard this, but Russia has done, number one, they will not allow Russian orphans to be adopted into countries where transitioning kids is legal.
Yeah.
Also, now Russia has said, if you're a parent and you have an ex-wife or ex-husband who wants to transition your kid, you can come here to Russia and we will be asylum for you.
Yeah.
It's pretty wild. I mean, I don't know if that's going to happen with and I don't know if we might get into a position also where we just have sanctuary states, because I think we have a bunch of sanctuary states for, wanting to transition kids in divorce, but none who want to keep the kids as the kids.
Yeah, I know one state, one family where the father was trying to protect his kid from his wife trying to transition his son, and they were in Texas, but then she took the kid to California. So now the California courts are upholding her rights to, transition the kid, and he can't do anything about it because they're, a sanctuary state of the other direction now. So maybe we are moving toward this big sorting out between, red states and blue states. And, maybe that's the future for this country.
Yeah. That I just had Jeff Younger on 2 shows ago, but I haven't uploaded yet. But anyway, getting back to also to what do you think about, what's going to happen in the Middle East and what's going to happen with Ukraine, of course?
I think, as that great American philosopher Yogi Berra said, it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. But it's the Middle East. I mean, obviously things were looking very bad for Israel before Syria collapsed. I mean, they were bogged down in southern Lebanon. They were bogged down in Gaza. They were, engaged in a little missile tit for tat with the Iranians, which frankly the Iranians had the upper hand unless the Israelis wanted to use their nukes. I think Syria really changes things in the short term, much better for Israel, much better for Turkey. But in the long term, it's hard to see how that's going to sort out, because right now they've done to Syria what we did to Libya, and it's even more chaotic than Libya was.
Yes.
I don't know if the Russians will hold on to their bases there. I don't know if the Iranians still will be able to supply Hezbollah, because after all, if you have chaos in Syria, that may mean they can still get their stuff through to Hezbollah. So I don't think the Israelis are out of the woods. I think the bigger question is whether Donald Trump has made a lot of promises to a lot of very influential people about what he's going to do with respect to Iran once he gets in. And that's, he did not want to go to war with Iran during his first term. Mm-hmm. I don't know if he will be able to escape that during his second term. So that's my big concern in the Middle East right now.
I don't know if they're going to, how a war is going to be people react to a war at home. You've got a bunch of disillusioned younger men now. Mm-hmm. And they're going to say, why should I fight for America? You're even hearing stories, about how these long lines of military families are now just telling their kids, don't go in, because it's.
Well, yes, that's one of my concerns, actually, is that, if Kamala Harris had become president, I think that phenomenon would have been there, very strongly. If Donald Trump is there, and making America great again and telling them this is standing up for America, are they going to swallow that? And I think some of them will. I mean, there are a lot of mega fans out there will say, Donald Trump, he's playing 5-dimensional chess. This is for America, and they may believe that.
Yeah, certainly. It's really hard to say. Jim. Also, as we've talked about the sorting out. As pessimistic as it sounds, you can't have a civil war and have an empire. At least not very easily.
That's a good point.
And what happens if that happens here? What happens to our entire apparatus of this? It's got to crumble eventually.
Or conversely, if the global empire crumbles for various reasons, and that then results in the end of dollar seigniorage, the end of all the cheap stuff at Walmart, et cetera, does the drop then in living standards precipitate social unrest and things going kinetic domestically? I mean, I think the two things are very closely related.
And we've already, to a certain extent, had a drop in living standards in this country, which is not something. It's kind of interesting too, because a lot of the things we do buy have gotten cheaper. TV sets and microwave ovens and refrigerators.
Which is technology, of course, yeah.
But it's those really expensive things we buy that have gotten more expensive. Like housing has gotten more expensive, college has gotten a lot more expensive, healthcare has gotten a lot more expensive, and of course your car has gotten more expensive.
And food.
Yeah. Maybe food, but So those little expenses, but the big expenses are offsetting that. Yeah, I mean, when you hear people say, I don't think I'll ever be able to buy a house, it's really kind of troubling, and it makes me wonder. You buy the house, you have the family.
But Chris, I mean, there's a nice little pod waiting for you of about 300 square feet, and you'll be 15 minutes from every place you need to go, and you'll get you will own nothing, but you'll be happy. I mean, what's your problem?
Yes.
You subversive you.
Jim, how is that any different from the company towns?
It isn't.
Of 100 years ago. It's but they said that was all wrong. The company town where you worked in the coal mine. You had this little cabin that the coal mine company gave you, and you went and spent your money at the company store, and that was all you could do.
And that's and again, how is that different from communism? You're not necessarily part of a collective, but what you are is a radicalized, segregated individual who is interchangeable with every other individual. And as long as each one is simply a cog in one big machine, what's the difference?
Yeah, it's almost a type of feudalism, really. But yeah, and the thing is, there's no mobility. It's, I still think there's there's still a certain degree of mobility, but it seems like it's getting harder for people.
Yeah, at least under feudalism,
Yeah.
a lord had a reciprocal obligation to protect his inferiors. That obligation won't exist in this system.
Yeah, it won't exist in the system. It's very. Yeah. Are there anything else you think's interesting happening around the world now? We've talked about Israel and Syria. Some people say Syria might actually be a trap. Is that possible? I mean, a trap for Erdogan, or
it could end up becoming a trap, a quagmire for both the Turks and the Israelis and some other players as well. I doubt very much it was set as a trap. I think it was. I mean, there are a number of things going on. You do hear reports from Syrian soldiers how they were going to the front ready to fight, and then their commanders told them to stand down and run away. And again, there was some level of corruption and incompetence there. I don't know where exactly was the point when the Russians and the Iranians decided to pull the plug. I don't know if there are any other bigger deals or assurances going on that involve the Turks and the Israelis and the Americans. But again, I think we're going to see such chaos and horror going on in Syria for a while. Yeah, the Israelis could find themselves regretting this, and the Turks as well. But I don't think we're at that point yet. I think the other big thing going on, of course, now is Ukraine. And that's where, just the reports today, Donald Trump is saying something like, well, deploying of EU forces there would be something that he would support. And I think it really comes down to the big question, what does Moscow intend to do? Do they intend to win a military victory, or do they intend to come up with some kind of an agreement with Washington, because obviously Washington's the only thing that matters. And what effect will that be?
Do you think if Trump had been president instead of Biden, that the war would have happened?
Yeah, probably. I mean, let's remember, Trump is the one who actually cranked much more military equipment in the Ukraine, lethal military equipment that was not being allowed under the Obama administration. I mean, he appointed as his special envoy for Ukraine, Kurt Volker, who was a lobbyist from Raytheon, who oddly enough thought that just what the Ukrainians really needed were more javelins, which are manufactured by whom? Well, by Raytheon. So, I mean, basically, you had the real militarization of Ukraine going on and the violations of the Minsk agreement that were taking place under Trump. Now, when the Russians in December 2021 offered the 2 draft treaties with NATO and the United States and offered to negotiate, and of course were turned down flat, would Trump have accepted that offer? I don't think so, because again, I don't think he was ever in control of the national security apparatus of this administration, and I'll be very skeptical that he will be this time either.
Yeah. And of course, so much of this is just driven by these all these, war profiteers. Is that what?
Yeah.
Is that,
I think that's a factor. That's what we call doing well by doing good. If you look at all of our various adventures, whether it was Iraq and so forth, people profiteered. Look at Hunter Biden and the big guy when it comes to Ukraine, right? Yeah. But I think it's a little simplistic when people say it's all about the money. Just follow the money and that'll take care of it all. Yeah, the money's there, and people who are making a lot of money are calling the shots. But they also are, in my opinion, highly ideological. They're like the Bolsheviks in the 1920s. They really do believe their own propaganda about, democracy and human rights and the sacred rainbow flag and all the rest of it that goes with the American empire, because they think they have the right to rule the whole world. And that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, it's almost this, it's almost this attitude. If you remember, what they always said in the Blues Brothers, we're on a mission from God.
Yes.
One of the lessons from that movie is when people believe that they're on a mission from God, they have this attitude that anything goes.
Yeah.
No matter what it is, it's speaking of it's only democracy. It's only democracy when it's what they want. What do you think about what recently happened in Romania with those elections?
I was just going to mention that. Yeah, but just a footnote on that. When you mission from God, but as Mike Pompeo said, we lie, we cheat, we kill. That if you've got the divine mantle on your shoulder, You can do all sorts of things, but I mean, again, this was the same mentality as the Bolsheviks. There is no absolute morality. There's only the class conflict, and everything we do is by definition right because of our place in the class conflict. Yeah, what happened in Romania is a good place. What was a good point? What we saw there was essentially a coup, not a military coup, but a judicial coup, because democracy means that if the people don't vote right, that has to be nullified. And again, we're going to see that. For example, you see all this talk in Germany about banning the AfD from the elections because they get too close to possibly winning, or also recently what they're trying to do now with Marine Le Pen in France to disqualify her. For, it's what they call lawfare, of course, what they tried to use against Trump here. But I think it's a global phenomenon as well in the democratic countries, at least.
Yeah, same with all the ridiculous lawfare against Trump, which I actually think made a lot of people more sympathetic to him.
That's true.
It's so ridiculous, when they try to, rewrite the rules or stack the rules. I mean, and this lawfare is just, ridiculous. I mean, I often joke, is that what's going to happen? Is we're just all of our big decisions are going to be made by lawsuits instead of voting. It's it'll be I'm not sure what the word that is, just a government by lawyers. And of course, America, I believe, has, by far more lawyers per capita than any other country.
I think somebody called it critarchy, I guess, ruled by judges. Yeah, because after all, the judges are the ones who, in the legal system are the ones administering the lawfare. So I think I don't know if there's actually a word for, there must be a Greek word for ruled by lawyers, but I don't know what it is.
Yeah, ruled by lawyers. Yeah, it's the Romania, and also, what do you think is going to happen with China and Taiwan?
I don't know. I mean, I think the idea that the Chinese are just itching to attack Taiwan is ridiculous. And of course, everybody who talks about that keeps ignoring the fact that according to everybody, including the government on Taipei, Taiwan is part of China. They just argue about which is the legitimate government of all of China. That's the only difference. Taiwan is not an independent country under anybody's standard, and that's the one thing China has said that would cause them to take military action if it were to declare its independence. But I don't think that's what the Chinese intend to do. I think again there's this like a 50-year program of reunification. I think if actually this is where we get back to the democracy problem. Is that if the Kuomintang, the old, nationalist party, Chiang Kai-shek's party, which was one of the original anti-communist parties, were to win, there probably would be some kind of peaceful reconciliation with the mainland because they're essentially both Chinese nationalists. I mean, they're on both sides of the strait. I mean, we keep talking about communist China, despite all the pictures of Mao and all that. I think it's basically Han nationalist wine inside of a Maoist bottle. That you have all the accoutrement and the symbols of communist China, but the actual ethos in it is Confucian and Han nationalists. So I think they're going to take the long view on this. But I think that just as we wanted Ukraine as a kind of cat's paw against Russia, that we want Taiwan as a kind of a cat's paw against China. So I don't know that we want to provoke a conflict with China right now, but I do think that's in the cards for maybe a few years from now. That I think one of the big differences between this administration and the previous administration is for the previous administration, Russia was at the top of their hit list, whereas these guys would like to find a way through some Minsk 2 kind of Minsk 3 kind of deal to put Ukraine on hold while they go after Iran after they take care of Iran, and then to go after China. How that looks exactly, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think so either. Yeah, and going after Iran, I can't really remember the last time Iran provoked a war with anybody. It seems like they've had wars provoked with them, but so what?
Well, what all this talk about? Oh, they're the big support of global terrorism. No, they're not. The biggest supporter of global terrorism was the Saudis, the Emiratis, and frankly us and the Brits. I mean, we're the ones been supporting all these jihadist groups around the world. I don't know if the Saudis, because of their rapprochement with Iran and, MBS is trying to modernize the kingdom a bit, whether of course, they're trying to get out of the war in Yemen. So I don't know if there's some movement on that front, but, the idea that somehow Iran is the big bad guy in the region, I don't think makes a whole lot of sense. By the way, relating back to what you said with Syria, obviously that was a big hit for the Iranians. But back to the Israelis in that regard, Israel has a habit of taking care of short-term threats and then wondering when they become the next threat. For example, they were among the original supporters of the Amal militia, the Shiite militia in southern Lebanon, that they thought would be a weapon against the PLO, which it was, but then it eventually turned into Hezbollah. They were one among the biggest supporters of Hamas earlier on for the same reason, as a weapon against the PLO. And then now they got Hamas on their hands. They wanted Iraq out of the way. They, of course, behind the big lobby behind the Iraq war. And then after they got rid of Iraq, then they said suddenly, oh my God, Iraq's enemy, Iran, has now been empowered, and they have now a major footprint in Iraq. So I think it's entirely possible that whatever order arises in Syria may turn out to be Israel's biggest nightmare on its doorstep that they helped create.
Well, that seems to be, America. We fund, we give money to bin Laden in the 70s, and then he turns on us, and you fund it. Who's our enemy in 20 years? It's whoever we're funding now. It's so ridiculous, and it seems it's a self-licking ice cream cone, so to speak. I don't know when Americans are just going to get up and scream and say this needs to end.
I don't think they will, Chris. And again, especially, that's one of the bad things, if you will, about Trump's victory, is that I think a lot more Americans were starting to see the little man behind the curtain when the Democrats were in power, but unfortunately they tend to put it in partisan terms. Republicans, good guys; Democrats, bad. Oh, now we have a patriot back in charge, so everything is going to come out. Now the orange savior is going to make everything right. And I don't think they see that. At best, it's kind of a thermidor that the woke revolution continues, but now we're going to take a little time out on some of the more crazy aspects of it while we go thump the Iranians or somebody.
Well, Jim, one reason why the woke revolution will occasionally take a minor retreat, but the thing that never changes are the college professors.
Mm-hmm.
They just get worse with every generation. And there were people calling out college professors, 30 years ago, and nothing changes. I don't know, it's kind of a weird thing too, because you can have a civilized society without colleges, but colleges can't exist without a civilized society, and yet they want to destroy civilization.
They're incubators of barbarism at the colleges.
They're incubators of barbarism. They glorify criminals and think that shoplifting under $1,000 shouldn't be prosecuted and stuff like this. And I don't know, when they realize that's not going to come back and bite them.
Unfortunately, the only thing that I think is going to be policed on college campuses from this administration, and of course, that's aside from the point whether the federal government should have anything to do with college campuses at all, but what they're going to do probably is tie federal funds to whether or not the college campuses crack down on what they regard as anti-Semitic speech in support of Gaza or whatever. In other words, they will police that, and they'll tie money to that, but not to anything else.
Yeah. It's funny how all these big donors suddenly took notice once that came about. It's, they've been, it's interesting, too. I don't know if you saw that video, but Crystal Magnum came out and admitted that she lied in the Duke lacrosse fiasco.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's and she actually I think she had some jail time for something else, but, just, this is what they promoted. And, it didn't matter, it was just a bunch of white boys who play lacrosse, so it's okay to demonize them.
Sure. Or like well, they were like the Covington kid on. So it's nice that some of these things do get exposed, and maybe there is some justice in the world in some cases, so we can be thankful for that.
Yeah, well, I don't know. It wasn't disclosed, but I do think those boys got a nice settlement from the university. But but that's something else too. Just the whole sex war in the West, I think, is going to possibly rip things apart, because the boys aren't going to go off to fight if there's not a girl waiting for them back home. And, it's like, what do I have to fight for if I can't, get married and have a family,
Yeah. Well, and of course, I guess this is the first time in American history that less than half the population is married. One of the things, I was reading a book about the early years of the American Revolution. And as the British Army was coming through Long Island near New York, they were utterly stunned at how prosperous Americans were compared to back home. That even in those days, we were the best clothed, best fed, best housed people in the world. And this this actually had a huge impact on our standard of living when it came to things like marriage and forming a family and having children. Because back then, the two things were very closely correlated. So you look at the early decades of the American Republic, huge population growth, a huge, I think like almost a tripling of the population in the first 50 years, almost all of which was natural increase. Very little of that was actually immigration at the time.
Yeah, and I do think that maybe the healthiest societies you're not going to have. Everybody's not going to have 8 kids, but you might have at least, have a healthy society where the average might be 3 or 4 kids. It's
So the lab, but when you have 1.2 kids,
when I don't know what you're going to maintain. And you've got to look, too, at some of these, but still the Islamic countries that are somewhat reproducing, and still African countries. Yeah. It makes me wonder, and it's just as bad in East Asia, where South Korea being something like 0.7, as we talked about. It's
crazy, and and then you add to that. I had a piece that was on the Ron Paul site about the only thing we have to fear is extinction itself. There are advocates of extinction out there. I mean, Chris, I don't want to sound like too much of a conspiracy theorist. Oh, well, okay, call it a spoiler alert. But I don't think all of this is accidental. I mean, I think there is something in the mentality of the ruling nomenklatura, and again, that's another term from the Soviet Union, that really does want to see a radical degradation and decrease in the population. I don't know to what level. I think certainly in the developed countries, as you say, in Europe and the Far East, I think their replacement with people from the Middle East and Africa is part of that. At some point, I assume they will be killed off as well. But right now, they're useful weapons against the countries that are the primary targets, which I think are primarily the countries in the European Christian civilization and to some extent then in Asian civilization.
Yeah, it makes me wonder if if a lot of these things are going to survive. I mean, I don't know if whether or not Christianity will survive it, but sometimes when people need something to believe in, they go look for that. Islam is certainly not showing any signs of going away. It's going to stick around, and the other religions, I don't know. It's, but the culture of because, Western civilization, is still accomplished so much. Really, it's so wild when you hear talk about reparations for slavery, and yet Western Christian culture was the most anti-slavery culture that ever existed.
Yeah, who put a stop to it? Yeah. What other culture, what other world culture ever objected to slavery in principle? None ever did. I mean, it was a fact of life. And we say, well, we have a few hundred years, we had a transatlantic slave trade, but it was the European powers themselves that put a stop to it, not only in the transatlantic trade, they also went around to the Indian Ocean and put an end to the Arab slave trade there that had been going on for much, much longer. As far as religion goes, Islam is growing, although apparently most of that is natural increase. And now with the internet, you do find more and more people leaving Islam. Obviously, in the Western countries, religion, we have the rise of the nuns, NONES, in all the Western countries. But more conservative areas of Christianity do seem to be growing somewhat. Obviously, again, I would point to Orthodoxy, but I think there is something that you're right about, is that when everything's fallen apart, some people are going to try to say, well, something has to be real out there, and glom onto something they think is a rock that can provide some stability to their lives, not only materially but spiritually.
Yeah, or people just look for things that give them hope. I think Americans, it's like, well, Trump's not great, but what else is there? I mean, I have to admit, if you've looked at my shows, I've become very obsessed with the man in Argentina. I think what he's doing is absolutely amazing. And just and I just kind of say to people, well, if not him, then what is there?
And also the fellow in El Salvador, I haven't followed quite as closely.
Yeah. That's an interesting case, and One thing I've noticed too, I once read about Bukele in El Salvador. He was out at a McDonald's with his family, and I just said, okay, here he's the president of the country, but he's still out there with regular people.
Yeah. Can you imagine that here? Can you imagine?
I'll question his judgment for going to McDonald's, but still he was out there where where you're going to see regular people. And people might walk up to him. Oh, hi, Senor Presidente. It's like, he can get out and talk to people. I mean, some of his tactics might have been heavy-handed, but and some of these smaller countries too. I think that because they're closer to the people, I think in some cases they really do care about their countries. They want their countries to be better off.
Well, what do you think about Bukele and Bitcoin?
Hard to say, really. I did go down there. It seemed like a country where family was still valued, and it seemed like it was pretty optimistic. So that could certainly. It's still not really that widely. I mean, there's certain little enclaves where there's Bitcoin, but it's still not everywhere. But,
oh, really? Okay.
But it could certainly work out for them. I mean, there was a lot of optimism. I also got to warn you, San Salvador is the worst traffic city anywhere. I don't know. It's funny. You don't really see really horrible traffic cities until you get out of America. That's another thing.
Well, I guess you haven't been to Moscow then.
I've not been to Moscow, but yes,
traffic there is pretty bad.
And San Salvador is not that big a town, but you can still get it. And you could get an Uber. You could get an Uber. Usually like $3 to go anywhere in town, so that's not too bad. If you want to go visit those places, get a cheap Airbnb and live up. I had a great Airbnb down there too. That was when I went down there a while back. It was and you could just, and sometimes it just felt like it was an optimistic place. It seemed like he and Argentina. Yeah, I hope. Yeah, I think it'll all work out. I although there's so much corruption to cut, I've noticed too that the smaller countries tend to rise and fall faster. They can go from good to bad or bad.
Well, that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, a country like America or Russia or India, China, something like that is so big. I mean, it's like trying to turn a huge oil tanker around or something.
Yeah, it's interesting, to think about the airport at San Salvador. That airport has no domestic flights because the country is so small. There's no other airport to fly to. You just it's only 3 hours from DFW, so it's really not that far away. It's easier. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, I've never been there. I mean, I lived in Mexico for a while. I've been to Santo Domingo, but my Latin American travel is not that extensive.
I got to ask you too. What sometimes there's been this threats. Oh, we're going to go invade Mexico to take out the drug cartels. What do you make of that? I like Mexico. I'm not. I said I might go fight for Mexico if that happens.
I don't know what to make of it. I mean, I do think we need to get control of the border physically, and I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't know if you do that, whether that can fence whatever the chaos is of the car. I don't know to what extent a porous border is a safety valve for growing anarchy in Mexico because of the relationship between the government and the cartels. If you close that off, where that safety valve is closed, whether Mexico gets even worse in many respects. And I know people say that there's no way for us to deal with it except to have an incursion into Mexico. I'm going to go get Pershing back to go after Pancho Villa or something like that. I would not welcome that prospect. I'd be very skeptical of the rationale for it, but I don't think I know enough about the details of what you would hope to accomplish in such a case. I mean, maybe Mexico would come apart and you would sponsor some, puppet states in northern Mexico to try to keep things, messy things on that side of the border. I don't know.
Well, if all the drugs were just legalized, would that kill the cartels? I mean, that seems like an easy way, Jim. And I've got to ask too, will all these people come here if you just get rid of all the handouts? I mean, if you're going to put out the bird seed, don't complain when the pigeons are shitting everywhere.
Well, if wishes were horses, then beggars would ride. I mean, since we're never going to do that, I suppose it's an academic question.
Yeah, I just worry about, what's going to happen, if they build a wall and make it harder for us to leave, because the Berlin Wall wasn't about keeping the West
Interesting
Berliners out of
point. Yeah.
Berlin. It's
Yeah.
There's such a risk here. With but yeah, that's one thing about Bukele, by the way, he's actually actually put in programs. He says, I want to make it easier for Salvadorans to come back if they want to come
Yeah.
back.
Yeah.
Like they can bring their car in without paying any taxes on and stuff like that. It's because
by the way, that's the other thing, by the way, that in terms of Trump's promises, not only to control the border, but mass deportations. There's a guy, this gentleman, Homan, that he's put in charge of the border czar, which is not actually a position in the federal government. So I don't know what that means exactly. But I don't imagine there's going to be a whole lot of mass deportations. I mean, there may be some stepping up of the deportations that are already in legal process. But I don't see that there's going to be any kind of mass roundups. I think we're going to see sanctuary states and cities and people going there, and the feds will not have the ability or, frankly, the balls to confront them. I mean, there are laws on the books that make it a felony to conceal an illegal alien from apprehension by the immigration authorities. Those have never been enforced, and I don't expect them to be.
Yeah, and the prospect of you're talking about Mexico. You're talking about a very hostile place to fight a war. I mean, you're talking about deserts where it goes up to 120 degrees in the summer.
Yeah.
You're talking about mountains. I would not.
Well, we did it once.
Yeah. And the Pancho Villa was a complete fiasco. With Pershing going after Pancho. I mean,
no, I'm talking about the Mexican War though. We conquered Mexico once for what it was worth.
Yeah. Well, I think some of that was fought on Texas soil, but it's it was very, and then of course there was the French invasion in the 1860s, which ended up being just a quagmire. I mean, so I that's one thing I didn't realize until I went to Mexico the first time. Mexico is mountainous everywhere. It's like Switzerland, but it's just a whole lot bigger. It's all mountains, and it's just not easy to fight an offense. It's very easy to defend mountains, and it's very hard to, fight an offensive war. And not to mention, you got the heat, you got the weather. It's just, Mexico's really got its own protections in place.
And of course, remember Colin Powell's pottery barn rule: you break it, you fix it. You break it, you pay for it. It was one thing for Winfield Scott to follow Cortez's route from the coast and then conquer Mexico City and make him sign a treaty. It's another thing today if we were to go into Mexico and then be responsible for the place. Talk about a money pit.
Oh, geez, yeah. You're talking a country who still has 100 million people. Yeah, it's just not. No. And we've got so many people. I mean, so many Americans probably have at least one or two Mexican friends. Mexico's our neighbor. I live with that. Just the same reason I accept Canada. It's
well, exactly, and that's the other thing that kind of bugs me is like if you look at so much of American policy around the world is aimed at disrupting other people's constructive activities, like the Belt and Road. We have to stop that thing because Eurasia is going to be integrated, and that would be terrible for us. I don't know how that hurts us. But why don't we build anything? We don't build anything here at home anymore. Where's our Belt and Road initiative through the Western Hemisphere that would maybe help develop some of these countries and keep a lot of these people at home because there's prosperity there? We don't care about doing that. We don't build anything that would actually make it. You talk about, if they had a better living standards in those countries, maybe they wouldn't be coming here where they could figure they would get latched onto a better ready-made standard of living.
Or just, the destabilization of crime and all that stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. We don't care about that stuff. We really don't care.
Yeah. So I don't know where we go, and it seems like, we don't even take care of our own infrastructure that well anymore. I mean, people are, it's like they send more money, to Ukraine and Israel, but is there any money, for the people who are still cleaning up after Hurricane Helene? It's
And when Chuck Schumer just said, "Hey, we're out of money," that's not. But he's going to turn around and send the next tranche to Israel and Ukraine and everybody else.
Yeah, and it's but that's another story. Well, Jim, I think this has been a good talk. I think we've covered a lot of different topics here. It's certainly where can we find you out there?
The only place to find me is on Twitter, or now called X, at
Yeah.
Jim Jatras. So just at
Yes.
with my name, Jim Jatras, one word. You can see there at the top of my pinned comment is my
Yeah.
pinned post is my book. I tried to warn you, which is a collection of my writings over the last 5 decades. So
Yeah.
there I am.
That's the story for a lot of us. We tried to warn you, but that's for libertarians. It's
Yeah. Well,
yeah, it's please like this video, subscribe to the channel, go buy my novel Escape from the Village, check out my Substack, and of course, you can go to buymeacoffee.com. Thank you, Jim Chatras. We're
thank
out.
you, Chris.
Buy my novel Escape from the Village from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you.